Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with special members of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Today, we are in for a real treat, as our guests are both renowned quilt appraisers, Vickie Coleman and Allison Rainboth. Allison was born in Torrance, California, and grew up in Glendale, about 10 minutes from the Rose Bowl, where she actually learned to drive in the parking lot. She attended UC Riverside and completed her graduate work in biology at UCLA. Allison and her husband, Walter, moved to Wisconsin in 1992 and to their present home in 1993, where they are always working on their old house. She loves animals and currently has 3 cats. Vickie, the oldest of 3 girls and an admitted Army brat, was born in Fort Benning, Georgia, lived in Germany for a time, moved every 2 years as a youngster, and attended 4 high schools. She attained an undergraduate degree from the University of Tennessee in textiles and clothing and completed her Master of Science in Vocational Education from the University of Kentucky. She opened Bluegrass Quilt Appraisal, LLC, following enrollment in the American Quilter Society Appraisal Skills course in 2018. She lives in Lexington, Kentucky, near her daughter, and has 2 tuxedo cats. Both Vickie and Allison are prolific quilters and are involved in education and myriad quilting ventures. Hi, Vickie and Allison, and welcome to So-and-So.
Thank you, Meg.
Thanks, Meg. Glad to be here.
It's so good to have you both. You know, I had the privilege of meeting each of you in person. Vickie in Paducah at Quilt Week and Allison in Madison at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show. And then we found out you know each other. So having you on the show just seemed to be a perfect opportunity for a wonderful conversation. So let's start on how each of you learned how to sew and who influenced in that learning. Vickie, we're going to start with you.
Well, I have to say that the overwhelming influence on me dealing with textiles and all things textile related would be my grandmother, my dad's mother. She had 5 boys, and unfortunately, we did not live here except when my dad was overseas. But I didn't care what she was doing. I just wanted to spend time with her, and that's where I learned about tatting, crocheting, knitting, and eventually quilting. By that time, she wasn't doing a lot of quilting, but she was sewing. So, my first experience, I think I was 13. I decided I wanted to make a dress, and she helped me, and it actually turned out reasonably well. And so the groundwork was laid.
And the first quilt that you made, do you still have that?
Well, yes, I do. The first quilted project I made is actually a pillow.
Mm-hmm.
And I made that when I moved to Lexington after I married, and I still have it. It has unfortunately faded badly, but I do have it. And the first real quilt I made is actually in the frame. I made it when my daughter was 3,
Mm-hmm.
the top. She's now 37.
So it's been a part of your life for a while.
It
It's
has.
nice. Allison, how about you? How did you learn to sew and who influenced you?
That's a funny story. My mom was an avid garment sewer until the polyester era, which was about the time that I got old enough to have an interest. And of course, she didn't want to work with polyester because it was so different from regular natural fabrics. But my brother, who's almost 5 years younger, wanted to go to day camp. And they said, "Oh, sure, Jamie can come, but you have to come too because we're shorthanded." So she hunted around and she learned that the Singer Sewing Store gave lessons. So for a week, she dropped me off at the Singer store into the custody of the Singer sewing ladies with my sack lunch. And by the end of the week, they had me running all the sewing machines, and I'd made a gym bag and a pair of pajama pants, and I was hooked. So she had a sewing machine and she let me use it, and I went on from there. So
It was your summer camp.
it was my summer camp, and I had a blast. And, as a young person, I think, I was so fearless. I would try anything and had great fun with costumes and stuffed animals and such. And then, kept going as an adult. So
And when you started quilting, do you still have your first quilt?
I do not. I made my first quilt about, I want to say, my first pieced quilt I probably made about 1982. And unfortunately, some of the calico fabrics that were available at that time were not very good. And of course, I didn't know any better than to throw it in the wash machine. So it lasted for probably 12 to 15 years. And then two of the fabrics just disintegrated.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have it anymore.
So, and I hear a recommendation from an appraiser saying to people, don't throw your quilts in the washing machine.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. You will be hearing more about that later.
So, you both do something that I think is absolutely fascinating. And I'd like each of you to talk about your journey on how you became a quilt appraiser. So, Allison, let's start with you.
Oh, okay. I had a relatively long journey. I became a long arm quilter in 2003 and ended up in a storefront downtown Berlin because the long arm I bought was too big to get into my house. And I'm not from Berlin, obviously. I'm from LA, so I was a curiosity. People came to visit me to see what the heck I was doing with this giant piece of equipment. And then they started bringing me things to share. I found this in the cupboard. Do you know anything about this? Or, grandma's moving into assisted living and she had these in the cedar chest. Have you ever seen anything like this before? And in the beginning, it was mainly 1930s stuff, which I did recognize. Then they started bringing me things that were older. So I embarked on a long study of fabric history, fabric dyeing, lots of things around that. And in 2005, I went to Paducah and I took the 3-day appraisal studies skills class.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of class, I was told to go forth and appraise. And I did that for a really long time. And in 2019, I finally certified.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me a while to get there. Mainly in Wisconsin, there are certain kinds of quilts I don't see a lot of that are covered on the exam. And I needed to be sure that I was confident about those before I tested. So that is it in a nutshell.
So, Vickie, how about you?
Well, I was getting ready to retire from my career as an educator, and I remembered when my dad retired, he was at a loss on who he was. His identity had been totally wrapped up in being in the military. Big difference was he was only 42 when he retired, and I was older than that. But I thought, I need to have something else to do. I'm not going to sit around and do nothing. So I thought, okay, I could travel. I could travel. So I thought, oh, I'm going to retire at the end of December. This will be the first time I'll be able to go to Paducah in years because it never coincided with spring break. There's that thing about, you just don't take off for a week to go somewhere when you're teaching. So I got the catalog, looked through it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing on appraising. Oh my gosh, I love history. I love textiles. This is it. So I signed up for it. And that's how I ended up in the class. And at the end of the class, I knew this is what I need to be doing. Not want to do, need to do.
Yeah, it's interesting on both of your journeys. Now, I'd love to know, and I'm sure some of our listeners might be interested in becoming an appraiser. So, what skills are important, and what first step should they take? And we'll make that a jump ball. Whoever wants to jump in and answer that.
Okay, well, Vickie delegated this to me because recently I have been really honored to step up as part of the committee that certifies appraisers. So I'm speaking from my wheelhouse in that position. And the first thing that a person should do if they're interested in appraising is go shadow an appraiser when they're working. Go and kind of be their aide. Um, Oftentimes, some of the bigger shows will have those slots available. For instance, at the Great Wisconsin Quilt Show, volunteers can sign up to work with us for a couple of hours and see if you like it. And if you get as hooked as we did, then your next step is going to be to take that 3-day appraisal skills class in April in Paducah. At this point in time, it is only offered in Paducah. AQS owns the appraisal program.
Mm-hmm.
So we are bound by their decisions around placement of the classes, when they're offered, all that stuff. And at this juncture, Paducah is it, and it's always in April, and it's 3 days. So it's a serious commitment. But by the end of class, you will know whether this is something that you want to pursue or not. And then, like myself, you will be told to go forth and appraise. And at some future date, when you feel like you are ready to take off the training wheels, then you can apply to test. And that's when you would come back to Paducah. Usually, we ask you to sit the 3 day class again to make sure that you're updated on any changes since you took class the first time. And then you take an exam. There's a written component and an oral component. And if you pass, then you get to be an AQS certified appraiser.
Now, a couple questions from what you said. What does it mean to be a certified appraiser? I assume anybody can hang out a shingle and say, I can appraise quilts. But both of you are certified appraisers. Why should somebody look for that certification when they're looking for someone to work with?
Well, there are a couple reasons, and I'm going to kind of go from the back forward. Since my name has appeared on that list as a certified appraiser, I get lots of inquiries about appraisals and consultations with quilts.
Mm-hmm.
So right there, you've got a built-in way to market yourself. But from the individual's point of view, you know that the person looking at your quilt has met at least the minimum requirements to actually be able to speak knowledgeably about your quilt. And I think that's key because Allison and I have talked about this before. We see a lot of things on Facebook with different groups, and we're going, no, I'm not going to get into that. They have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm not going to call them out in public.
Now, I'm assuming a deep curiosity is one of the skills somebody needs to be an appraiser. What other skills are important? If somebody says, "Hey, I'm really interested in this," what should they be thinking about when they look in the mirror?
Are you willing to put in the work?
Hmm.
Because, like Allison said, it's very important to shadow somebody. I've had uh, two people shadow me, and one afterwards said, "This is a lot more work than I thought it would be." So she said, "I'm going to have to put this on the back burner." The other one is shadowing me for a third time coming up, and she has taken the classes and she does plan to pursue certification.
Hmm.
So I do think it's very important to realize it's not a short term process. The average is what, Allison, like 3 to 5 years to become a certified appraiser, start to finish?
Yeah, I would say if unless you have a particularly strong background in fabric dating coming into this, it's going to be closer to 5, and it might be more.
Hmm.
Um, I would say that yes, you have to recognize it's a commitment, and the first skill set that you should look at picking up is fabric dating, because that's at the heart of how we approach the quilts, is by determining, what age class do they belong in. And that was where I started my journey, because I was curious about what I was looking at.
Hmm.
And you can never study enough fabric. So I would say fabric dating would be right up there. And the other thing too, this job is much more physical than many people realize. And if somebody thinks that all appraisers do is sit in a chair and point at things, they will have some very big surprises. And that's why we suggest that people shadow before they make the commitment of going to Paducah. So they might get a really big surprise when they learn how much time we actually spend on our feet or bent in a 90-degree angle leaning over the appraisal table. So
So you get a workout while you're finding out about history. And I do want to ask you, I can't wait to find out more about the appraisal process and what you look for, but I'm curious. Um, how did you two meet?
We were trying to figure that out last night, and we actually met at the Midwest Fabric Study Group. There was a meeting in Shipshewana,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how we first met. It's a small world, quite honestly, and our paths just kept crossing.
Now here's the fun part for me. First, let's start with what do you look for when you're appraising a quilt?
the man who heads the program in Paducah is very fond of saying, It's just like real estate. Condition, condition, condition. And I would, I would add date, date, date to that probably. But when I'm appraising a quilt, the very first thing I'm going to do is have a conversation with the owner about what the purpose is for the appraisal. Sometimes people come in because they literally know nothing about the textile that they own. Maybe it was given to them as a gift or they inherited it and they're not a person that ever did any quilting themselves. And so here they are with this object and they have no clue. So what that means is that to the owner, either the quilt is an absolutely precious object or it's this thing they got stuck with. And by talking with them at the beginning, we can kind of ferret out which one of those it is. Because Vickie will talk about this as well. It's really hard to have to tell somebody that their grandmother's flower garden quilt is, relatively common on the market. I mean, common to abundant. And so it's not a priceless relic that's going to pay for their trip to Tahiti. So anyway, we look at the condition. We look at what kind of a quilt it is, i.e., how is it constructed? Is it pieced? Is it applique? How good is the quilting? Did the maker do anything special with the way she quilted the object? How structurally sound is it? Has it been well cared for? Did they throw it in the wash machine and consequently have a bunch of holes in it? Or is it pristine and looks like nobody ever slept under it? I think rarity is the other thing that comes to mind, that whether it is a newly made non-traditional quilt, i.e. art quilt, where there's only one of it because the maker is only ever going to make one, or it is an antique where my knowledge of quilt history comes into play. And I can say to the owner, wow, you've really got something special here. This is a Quaker silk and there aren't that many of these on the market. That rarity factor is usually the other thing that comes into play. And I'm sure Vickie's got stuff to add.
Well, when we hear that thing about real estate, location, 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 we as appraisers hear condition, condition, condition. And I say, well, I'm going to edit that. It's condition, condition, rarity. Because
Yeah.
I do have people who will make comments about, well, it's really old. And I go, well, sometimes I feel like I'm really old too. That doesn't make me more valuable. But the point is, like the grandmother's flower garden, sometimes we almost make a little joke about, well, how many grandmother's flower gardens will we see today? And there are abundance of them. It was the most popular pattern produced during the 1930s. So there is always that. And in fact, I do a lot more consultations than I do appraisals because I ask them, what is it you want from this? If you do believe it needs to be insured, that's one thing. But if you just want answers about what do I have, uh, who do you think made it in my family because I have no idea on dates, then we're going to do a consultation. And I can do several consultations in the time it would take me to do one appraisal. So, like I said, around here, I do a lot of consultations and help people fill in the gaps in their family history with this item.
Vickie, what's the difference between a consultation and an appraisal?
Well, a consultation doesn't talk about values and it's not a legal document.
Okay.
An appraisal is a legal document and it will put a value on that quilt. And I tell them, look, if I see a quilt among this group that should be insured, we're definitely going to pull it aside and it's going to be an appraisal. But most of the time, I just want to know, what do I have?
So you have talked about interviewing the person who has the quilt, asking questions, looking at some condition. Allison, you mentioned fabric dating before, so I'm curious. Through the whole quilt appraisal process, these are some of the things that you start out with. Then what do you do, and how long does something like this usually take?
Okay, so Vickie and I have slightly different focuses for where we appraise. And I think that that's why Vickie ends up with more consultations. I've been fortunate enough to land in the position where I do a lot of appraisals at big shows, like where you met me. And in those venues, almost all my clients, probably 3/4, are there to get their newly made quilt appraised for insurance purposes. And often they're doing that because they're going to show it somewhere else. They're going to need to ship it and they want to insure it. So they need me to prepare that appraisal. So obviously what I'm going to do then is I have a form which is tailored to the requirements of the insurance agencies that will actually insure a quilt under a fine art rider. And it's got a brief description, but it covers all the components of the quilt. Sometimes the quilt is hanging in the show, and I will stand there with my clipboard and fill out my form of measurements. How many blocks does it have? What fabrics did they use? What techniques were employed? I may be standing there looking at it. Or the better situation is when I can lay it flat on the table. It just takes some of the pressure off everybody because the quilt's just laying there. I'm not blocking the aisle. And we can get a good examination, really precise measurements, and some photographs. And the idea is to generate the information for a document such that someone reading it will have a pretty good mental picture of what this thing looks like. And then that's how we set our values, comparing it with similar pieces which are available in the open market. So for me, when I'm doing one of these things in a show situation, collecting the data for a written appraisal usually takes me about 20 minutes, with the client answering some questions for me along the way. And then what I do is I take all that information home and I put it in the computer because my handwriting is terrible. And then I go and hunt for the comps. And so finding comparative values can take me anywhere from 5 minutes if it's a grandmother's flower garden or something like a jelly roll race, newly made quilt. Or it can take me days if I have something which is a rarity and I really need to hunt around to see when is the last time something like this actually came on the market. And for me, that's one of the parts that makes it fun. So, what did I leave out, Vickie?
Well, I wouldn't say you left anything out because you were accurate in the aspect that I see a lot more vintage and historic quilts than I do newly made quilts. So, like I said, most of it, it's, for example, I've got someone who has 27 quilts they want consultation on. They don't want to insure them, they're hoping to actually sell them. So, we're talking about that, but they have no idea what the pattern names are. And to try to describe it to somebody without a photograph is extremely difficult. So, yeah, I do a lot more consultations.
One of you talked to me about fabric dating. This fascinates me. And I know I'm sure we need a whole lot longer than just this podcast, but you've got the eye. You see something, and right away you can say, "Oh my goodness, this is something." But how it kind of in a nutshell does fabric dating work?
Well, it's like fashion. Everything has a cycle to it. But like I'd like to tell people, nothing magically happens December 31st at the stroke of midnight that one fashion no longer exists and a new one is created. So there's some transition periods in there. Um, for example, I one of my first examples of a quilt, someone I know was doing a repair to a quilt, and she goes, "Oh, I want to show you this Civil War quilt." And I looked at it and I said, That's not a Civil War quilt." She goes, "Well, how do you know?" And I said, "That particular dye wasn't produced until about 20 years after the Civil War ended." So it's being familiar with things like that. In fact, it's interesting because she told the fellow she was repairing it for about that, and he scheduled an appraisal with me. And it
Mm-hmm.
turned out to be a 1910 quilt
Mm-hmm.
because the other fabrics were newer. And so they were from the teens, but there were some older ones in there from like around 1880. So it's like anything. It has a distinct look for that time period. Fashion changes. I bet you anything you can spot a 1960s garment compared to a 1990s garment.
True. Very, very good point.
So fabrics are the same way. They
Uh-huh.
have styles and fashion dictates what they look like.
So you each so love what you do. What's the most exciting thing about being a quilt appraiser?
Well, for me, it's filling in that gaps in family history. I love being able to help someone figure out who made this quilt. One of my favorite stories was a woman who brought in a quilt, and she was convinced her mother had made this. This is what she'd been told. Her mother made this quilt. And found out, I said, "Well, can you give me the dates?" Her mother had passed, and so she was trying to fill in some gaps. And I said, "Based on this quilt, what this quilt is telling me, your mother would have been about age 7 to about age 13. Do you believe this was her skill level?" And she said, "No." And I said, "Do you think maybe your grandmother made it and your mother helped her?" She says, "Yeah, that's probably what happened." Because her grandmother's dates made a lot more sense for the age of the quilt.
Hmm.
So, in mom's mind, she had made this quilt, or as the story was told over and over, that's what happened. She helped, and it became she made.
Interesting.
So, to me, that's one of the things I enjoy most is helping people fill in the gaps in their family history with their textiles.
Allison, how about you?
For me, it's the research. I started out as a research biologist. That's what I was doing at UCLA. And part of my brain still really needs that hunting for information part. And when I get a piece that I have questions about, it is always a fascinating dive into not just one rabbit hole, but a whole warren of rabbit holes. And so many different things about, dye chemistry, about the weaves of the fabric, about when certain threads were developed, things like different printing technologies. Is this quilt primarily roller printed, or do we still have some block printed fabrics in here, which are older? And being able to use my strong visual memory to say, okay, this quilt goes to about 1840 and this is why, but I have to research because there's some things about this I don't understand. And it's always kind of fun to tell the client that, and they're usually excited that they have something that's not run of the mill.
What about challenges? What's the most challenging thing about what you do for each of you?
For me, the most challenging thing is when I have to break the news to someone that what they have is not what they thought they had.
Hmm.
And because that's very disappointing. Uh, so that is the most challenging thing for me because you don't want someone to think that their family story isn't at all accurate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's very challenging for me personally.
Mine is related. It's usually around it's not worth what they thought it was going to be worth, or they have very strong opinions about their piece, and I have to explain to them that there's absolutely no way that piece, which is full of nothing but 1930s fabrics, could have been made during the Civil War. And I was at a guild meeting once where that exact situation happened. And I finally, I'm not going to argue with somebody, obviously, but I just had to say, well, the fabrics are telling me that the quilt was made in the 1930s and it's a nice piece, but it was not made in the 1860s. And the woman was all in a huff. And after the meeting, she came and apologized. And I felt bad, but at the same time, I was hoping that I'd done it gracefully enough to not, I don't know. It was just awkward, and I don't like awkward. And I don't like disappointing people. It's really hard to have to explain to people that, like Vickie said earlier, just because it's old doesn't mean it's worth a bunch of money. It's like
Hmm.
old tools or anything else on the market. The market for antiques right now in general is so soft that unless you have something that's in really stellar condition and really interesting to look at, it's not going to bring a strong market value. So, anyway, it's that sort of those awkwardnesses with dealing with people because we don't like to disappoint our clients. So,
I think it's fascinating. Both of you have used similar terms, and that the fabrics tell you things. It's like the quilts talk to you, and tell you their stories, or you kind of uncover those. So I'm fascinated and would love to hear a story or two from each of you about a quilt appraisal that was memorable.
Well, my most memorable one, I was asked to come out and look at some quilts. It was local, and this woman had inherited a a family farm, had been in the family for generations. And she was very excited and wanted me to come out and see these quilts. And particularly excited about two quilts because they were dated and they were crazy quilts. Well, I always say I'm not crazy about crazy quilts because they're either really good or, they're okay. But you don't want to ever say that to anybody. It's okay. So we went out there and she found 32 quilts on this farm.
Mm.
And so we went up to the farmhouse. They were up on the second floor in one of the two bedrooms. And we go through, and yes, there were some very nice quilts. A lot of 1930s quilts, which I do see a lot here in Kentucky from that time frame, and then some that were earlier. And as we start to head downstairs, I said, "Well, what about the other bedroom?" Because I could see there was a bed in there. She goes, "Well, I think there's something in there." I said, "Do you mind if we look?" So we go over and take the cardboard boxes off the bed. There's a chenille bedspread. Uh, there's a sheet, and there was a bunch of other things on top. And she goes, "Can you just look at the side and see?" I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." So I pull back the sheet, and I'm face to face with this glazed chintz that still has the glaze on it. And I really can't repeat the internal dialogue that was going through my head at that moment. But what I said is, "Well, this is a lovely quilt and it's quite old." She said, "Are you sure?" I go, "It predates the Civil War. Are
Mm.
you sure?" And I go, "Oh, yes, I am."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Would you mind if I take a couple photographs?" She goes, "Oh, no, not at all." And I said, "These are also English fabrics." And I said, "It is quite old." And I said, "What makes you think it's not old?" She goes, "Well, it's so big." And I said, that would have been common for this time frame.
Mm-hmm.
So I took some photographs and sent them to my mentor. And we were within 5 years of each other on dating that quilt. And the owner was kind enough to let me take it to Paducah, which was like 2 weeks later. Turned out it was circa 1835.
Mm. My.
And she thought it was a reproduction. And we're talking about what's going to happen with that quilt. And for me, the exciting thing is she is seriously considering donating to a museum here in Kentucky. And when I did take it Paducah, I was told that those were definitely English fabrics, and it probably came through a southern port. Well, how do you know that? Well, I didn't know, and it was news to everyone else there except the person who was telling us. The thread to quilt, the color matched the motif on the top. So if it was a blue hexagon, it was quilted with blue thread. And he said that only happened in southern cities. He said, and with it being English, it was imported probably through Charleston or Savannah. So I go back and tell the owner, she goes, "Well, honey, I still have family in Savannah." And I said, "Well, I know you also have a family genealogist. Find out who was living in Savannah in that time frame." So I haven't gotten back to her about it yet, but she said she was going to put her cousin on to that for sure. And I said, "Well, that only increases the excitement people will feel about this quilt if we can give people an idea of who actually made this." So it's been on that family farm for many, many decades, and it's in beautiful condition.
So, what's a quilt like that worth? Value?
Lots.
Uh huh.
And that's all I can say about it.
Okay. So let me ask you this. And I'll ask you, Vickie, and then Allison, when you share your story, you as well. Um, what's the most expensive quilt you've ever seen, or what are we looking at for perhaps the most expensive quilt anyone has ever handled?
Well, let me go back to that quilt for a moment. That quilt has more importance in historic value
Mm-hmm.
because it is in such good condition and we can trace it through one family. So to me, that's the more important value to that quilt
Mm-hmm.
because it's a snapshot in time, because it is in such good condition. And that's the reason when we don't discuss values because somebody might figure out who this actually belongs to. When I say it's worth a lot, it's
Mm-hmm.
worth a lot historically.
Fair enough. Allison, what has been memorable for you?
Well, I'll tell you about my memorable quilt, but let me just talk a little bit about value because that's a big part of my business. And antique quilts, it depends on the condition, the rarity, and the provenance. And the provenance often includes factors like were there any famous people involved in the production or stewardship of this quilt? Like, did it belong to Mary Lincoln's neighbor? Did Mary Lincoln's dressmaker make this quilt? Obviously, the one made by her dressmaker is going to be more valuable than the one made by her neighbor, even though they both have ties to a famous person. And that sort of link to fame um, changes values across the market. So pieces which have strong, well-known figures somewhere in their ownership trace are going to be worth more generally than a piece that was kept in the stewardship of a family that was not prominent.
Mm-hmm.
And the same goes for newly made quilts. We have quilt celebrities, just as we do in the sports world or anywhere else. And so generally, quilts that are made by people who are getting big prizes on the traveling circuit in a particular time period will bring more during their period of popularity. And an interesting thing that's happening at the moment is that some people who were very well known, say 15, 20 years ago, who were used to bringing very strong market values for their work, are now finding that, time moves on and their work is no longer as popular. And as a result, the market values are not as strong as they used to be. And that's pretty hard sometimes for people.
I'm
So,
sure.
but just off the top of my head, a king size bed quilt newly made, like you're making one for your nephew that you're going to give as a wedding gift. A king size bed quilt often appraises in the realm of $3,000 to $3,500.
Mm-hmm.
So when people hear numbers like that, they're a lot less likely to put the quilt in the dog bed. So at the other end of the spectrum, I haven't seen a grandmother's flower garden in the last 2 years that was worth appraising. And I tell people up front, if I don't believe that your quilt would bring at least $300 on the open market, it's not worth your money or my time to have me appraise it. And then I'll do a consultation if they would like me to do that. So I haven't seen a flower garden that was worth at least $300 in 2 years. So now, as far as the interesting stories, it's funny because in some ways, Vickie's and my stories are similar. I was called in to do a consultation for a local family that has a century farm, which in Wisconsin means that that family's owned the property for at least 100 years. And this family had very deep roots in New England. And the family had emigrated from Vermont to Wisconsin in the early years of settlement and had been on the farm ever since. And they had a pile of quilts on the bed, and there were some really interesting things in the pile. But there was one of them that really stumped me. And I remember when she uncovered it and I looked at it and I thought, this is something really different. It was a wool quilt, primarily made of like a deep, not quite navy, but a deep blue fabric. And also there were pieces of black. And then in the center, where the top of the quilt would go across the pillows, there was a brilliant red six-pointed star that was centered at the top of the bed in this quilt. And I looked at it and looked at it, and I just thought to myself, I really do not know what this is. Since wool is not typically a printed fabric, there were no visual cues about the date from looking at the motifs. So I was left with, okay, this thing's made of solid wools. And the family history was that it came to Wisconsin with them from Vermont. And I was uneasy about it. So I talked to them and I said, look, Paducah's coming up in 10 days. Would you let me borrow it? And I'd like to take it down and share it with the appraisal committee and the students in the class. And then she says, sure, you can take it. And by the way, I wanted you to know that the family story is that the red in the star came from a redcoat's uniform. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, and I didn't know whether to believe her or not. We hear a lot of stories. Well, I took it to Paducah. We got it down on the table in better light. You could see that the body of the quilt was constructed of pieces of garments. You could see the trouser legs. You could see the piece that goes inside the back of a collar. There were a couple pieces that clearly had started their life as sleeves. And so after discussion, it was decided that this quilt was very early, like circa 1815, and that it was made of pieces of uniforms. So, in consulting with the family, we were able to validate their family history, and it was determined that the quilt had been constructed of Union. Well, they weren't Union then, they were just American uniforms from the War of 1812, and that the red material was consistent with being from the uniform of a British soldier. It had been colored with cochineal red dye, and that way they knew that it was from a British suit coat. And I can't tell you how much it was worth, but what I can tell you is that it was into six figures, which for us, actually, that's not true. It was five figures by the time they went around about what it was actually worth. So five figures, and for a typical quilt, that's an extremely high value. We don't typically go over four figures. So, and I still dream about that piece. It was so amazing to see those uniform pieces under the light. Just amazing.
You know, these stories are just breathtaking. The history that you find, and just thinking what else might be out there that people haven't discovered yet. It's interesting. Now, let me ask you: if somebody does discover an old quilt, or they want to preserve a quilt, what are some of the things that they should know and do?
Don't wash it.
Don't mend it before you know what you have.
Hmm.
Don't take it to the dry cleaner.
Um, don't give it to your sister-in-law to have her put a new binding on it before you talk to somebody.
So basically, wrap it up, care for it, and reach out to one of you if it's an old
Yes.
quilt. Okay.
Or honestly, any certified appraiser or anyone who really does have a background in textiles would at least be able to direct you in how to best preserve your treasure.
Museums can be a good resource in terms of making suggestions about care. Museum staff, they're not allowed to do appraisals. It's a conflict of interest,
Hmm.
but they can often guide you to somebody who will know more specifically about it, was what you have and how to care for it. But why we always start with don't throw it in the wash machine is that I can't even tell you how many times I look at things on the internet and it's, oh, I bought this at an auction and I came home and put it in the wash and the poor old thing is just in rags. And I'm like, ugh, if you had just taken a couple days to do a little bit of looking into what you had, you would have known that your quilt was 150 years old and it was not meant to go
Mm.
in the washer. And oh, and along with that is you don't ever want to use a modern detergent on an antique quilt. If you have to wash it, like I bought one at an auction, and when I got it, it had pigeon poop on it. It had been in a barn. And there are a lot of things that I will tolerate. Pigeon poop is not one of them. So I had to wash it. I used a tablespoon of Dreft baby soap.
Hmm.
So something really, really mild. And what you need to do if you've got something that's older than the 1930s is check and make sure that you know what you have, and find somebody that's knowledgeable. And a lot of us are happy to talk to you on the phone about that stuff. People send me snapshots and I'll say, take some pictures and send them to me and I'll tell you if it's worth us meeting again. I don't mind doing any of that for free. That's okay. That's gratis. That's part of what I feel my job is.
Hmm.
So, what do you think, Vicki? What else would you do?
Oh, yes, and I tell people all the time, if it's pre-1930, it's a crapshoot if you're gonna clean it. And even the most gentle of methods, it really is a crapshoot pre-1930. But yes, I tell people, I said, "Look, it's not that big a deal." I like Allison, I get tons of emails and phone calls about, "What should I do with this?" I said, "Well, send me a lot of photographs and we'll talk about it. If you can live with it, great. If you can't, you definitely need to talk to somebody
Hmm.
who does know what advice to give you about preserving your quilt." And one of the other things I say is take it out of that cedar chest. Wood tannins and cellulose fibers like cotton, they weren't meant to be together. That cedar chest was meant for wool items. And even then, you need a barrier between the wood and the textile.
Interesting. I'm sure many quilts are in cedar chests because people
Oh,
just don't
yes.
know that. Sure,
Exactly.
sure.
So, I mean, I have that conversation all the time. The first thing is take it out of the cedar chest, wrap it in a white sheet, put a white sheet in the cedar chest, then you can put the quilt in. It's okay. It's the direct contact with the wood that's the problem. And I've even gone further and said, line that cedar chest with aluminum foil.
Okay. All right. Line a cedar chest with aluminum foil.
And then wrap your quilts in a white cotton sheet.
And I will often suggest that people put them in a pillowcase and then
Uh
put them
huh.
in the linen closet. And the other thing I wanted to share is a quote from someone I admire greatly, Xenia Cord. And Xenia has been known to say, well, whenever you get the urge to wash an old quilt, what you really need to do is have a glass of wine and go take a nap until that idea goes away.
Words of wisdom. I like that.
Yes, yes.
And in terms of storage, I said, where would your grandmother be happy? Would
Ah,
she be happy in a dank basement? No. Would she be happy in the overheated attic? No. But would she be happy being in your guest room? Probably.
I like that.
So I just tell them, treat it like it's your favorite grandmother.
You know, the quilts that we're talking about seem to be storybooks, and I call them of mystery and history. And we know that a lot of groups used quilts to communicate with each other. We've had the Giesben quilters on this podcast, and they've talked about that. So, do you have any examples of a specific way groups of people would use quilts to communicate? And then, how can people learn more about that?
Well, in terms of communication, women would make political statements through their quilts,
Hmm.
like Whig, Whig Rose. It was basically a variation of the Rose of Sharon, but the Whig Party, political party, the party of Henry Clay, a prominent Kentuckian. Then you had Clay's Choice. So women would, through their quilts, let you know what their political beliefs were. And then during the Great Depression, support for President Roosevelt's New Deal was they those ideas were also expressed through making of quilts, displaying the NRA, the National Recovery Act symbol, was done with quilts. Gifts were sent of quilts saying that we support your ideas. They were sent to the president and the first lady. So there are groups who have done that throughout history, and I know Allison has several stories also.
yeah. Some of the ones I'm most familiar with, for example, temperance quilts. Now, there are a lot of myths around temperance quilts. There are a lot of myths in quilting in general. But what I can tell you is that we do have examples of quilts that were made specifically for display by members of different national temperance groups, um, to carry the message. And often they were made to be used in a parade or some such. And they're identifiable because they will have WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they're often blue and white. And the other one that is reasonably common, if you know what you're looking for, are the Red Cross quilts from the World War I period, in white with red crosses. Oftentimes they are signature quilts with embroidered um, signatures, they were used as fundraisers. So women often, and this is true to today for sure, and I don't want to get into current politics, but suffice it to say that there have been a lot of quilts made in the last 12 years, and they have specific themes about social justice. And I don't want to venture off my areas of expertise, but there's some really amazing work going on. And if people want to see more about that, one good thing to do would be to just look at the images from QuiltCon for the last several years. If you want to actually get a more historical perspective, the Quilt Index, which is owned by Michigan State University, is available on the web, and it is a wealth of information because, in addition to images of thousands of quilts from all over the country and other countries, there's also an ephemera collection that you can look at. The International Quilt Museum in Nebraska has similar holdings that can teach you a lot about women and what they chose to say on their quilts. And well, there was more to that train and it kept on going. So, Vickie, what else can you add?
Well, I think you covered it, but yes, you can. There are lots of rabbit holes out there to go into, but because when I was doing some background research on quilts of the Great Depression, I found out way more than I thought I needed to know. But it has taken me in several different directions. So basically, just do your research and check your sources so that you know they are more likely to be accurate, and then cross check things. But yeah, there's a wealth of information out there at your fingertips. As I like to say, Mr. Google says, and then venture into that. But I tell you, for me personally, what I enjoy doing is I will also go to British sources because that's like the outside looking at us. And it's real interesting to look at the different perspectives, and you can find out a whole lot. That's where I found out about all these quilts that were made that represented the National Recovery Act was from a British source and an American source. And it was very interesting to read the two sides of that because the thing was only in place for 2 years, but there were a lot of quilts made during those 2 years. And if you find one that has a blue eagle on it with NRA, you've got something special.
Okay, I know people are on the lookout for that then. So I want to ask each of you, what's next for you and what's your dream?
Well, for me, being a retired educator, I have found that this has honestly filled what had been basically a void after I retired of my interaction with people and still educating. That is one of the things I enjoy most are doing presentations. And yeah, I do appraisals and consultations, but getting out and talking about quilts and the stories they tell and the connection they have to the past is probably the most exciting thing for me. And that's what I'm going to continue to work on and to grow is to do more interaction with groups and
Mhm.
doing presentations. And I hope to be real busy at doing that.
I think Vickie's going to be real busy.
I think
So
so.
she's such an engaging speaker, but my focus is a little different. I had mentioned that I've joined the appraisal certification committee. We need more appraisers. We need more people on deck to answer those questions and to help people to care for their precious family heirlooms. And we need to recruit more people to the program. So, one part of my focus for the next several years is going to be looking hard at how we can do that. We need to be sure that the people that we certify are highly skilled. And at the same time, we need to get more of them and we need to get them sooner rather than later. So, I'm going to be leaning in that direction. At least that's where my head is at the moment. So, looking at that.
We've covered a lot of ground today. Let me ask either one of you to answer this, or both of you. Is there any question I didn't ask that you wish I had?
Well, the only thing that comes to mind is that related to the highest value of quilt is who's the most famous quilter
Hmm.
that who's the most famous quilter working in the present day? And I would have to say that it's probably a woman named Bisa Butler.
Mm-hmm.
Bisa is an African American artist who makes large scale quilts, and she uses false color work, meaning that the fabrics are chosen not for the shade of color, but for their value within the composition. And her work has received all kinds of national attention. They're really interesting pieces in a number of ways. And I think that if you want to have your socks just knocked off by the caliber of some of the artwork being created within the quilt world, look up Bisa Butler and you'll learn a few things. So that would be probably the only thing I can think of.
And I do have to tell you both and people listening, Bisa Butler was the very first guest on this podcast.
Ooh, cool.
Ooh.
Yeah, and that was in February of 2021. Interestingly enough, she had an exhibit at the time at the Art Institute in Chicago, which had
Yes.
been closed down because of COVID.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to go see that exhibit once it reopened, and it just gives me chills to think about what you are talking about, Allison, and to have experienced that. So I will triple underscore what you said. If anybody gets an opportunity to see her work, don't walk, run, and go see it.
I completely agree. And I got to go see the same exhibit, and it was amazing.
It
And
was.
it was a little bit of a complicated day trip from where I live. And my friend and I were so, so glad we'd made the effort, because seeing them in person is such a different experience from seeing them in a book. So
Indeed. Vickie and Allison, it has been so much fun to talk to the two of you together today. If our listeners would like to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to do it? And Vickie, we'll start with you.
I would suggest email. It's bluegrassquiltappraisal@gmail.com.
Okay, and Allison?
And I would say the same thing because my website's not up yet. It's A Rainboth. It's the first letter of my first name and my whole last name, arainboth@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Again, thank you both so very much for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Meg. This was great.
Thank you, Meg.
Well, there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's become a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.